going to get these jobs. Well, I'll tell you what, some of those people aren't very productive. You know, they might have to go work in the economy, you know. So that to me is important. Besides, it was harder to make this sale back in the 70s on what we anticipated would happen, but today we're there. We know what has happened, and it's the debt. We've consumed our wealth. We can't borrow more. We can't tax anymore, and we have this huge debt. So we're just behind now. We're barely keeping up. So all the resources that government gets now is just keeping up, and it's all deficit financing. So they have to either print the money or borrow the money, and the economic growth just isn't there. But it isn't just a United States problem. It's a worldwide problem, and it's a monetary problem, because it's the basis of all the monetary system in the world is the U.S. dollar, which has given us an advantage over the many decades, but also the disadvantage is that we exported dollars and our jobs went with it, and we ended up with debt. And there's a limit to how much debt you can sustain. When a country is wealthy, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats get along pretty well. They claim there's not enough bipartisanship in Washington. Well, for decades, they're good bipartisan. They get whatever they want. They both agree. You spend your money, we'll spend our money, and we'll run up the debt. And so I don't think it's a lack of bipartisanship. I think it's bipartisanship doing the wrong things. And they've done this for so long, but they've consumed the wealth, and that is why we're facing a crisis today. And we have to come up with sound economic policies to bring us out of this deep, deep recession. For some people, it's a depression.
Now, as an Air Force pilot, I flew overseas. I flew out of Saudi Arabia for the no-fly zone in Iraq, and I flew in support of operations in Bosnia. So I saw firsthand that there's a big difference between military spending, overseas military spending, versus defense spending, because some of the things I was doing over there really didn't defend our country. The cuts that you're proposing to make in your budget, do those come out of military spending or defense spending? And how do you feel defense would be under a Paul presidency?
Right. The spending that I would cut wouldn't touch defense. Matter of fact, I think defense will go up. It'll be improved because we won't get ourselves involved in things we shouldn't be involved with. Our defense is not enhanced by starting wars, occupying nations, going into nation building, and being the policemen of the world. I think our military, our defense is hindered. So, and there's a couple different ways you can measure the cost of the military occupation and the activities we have, but I put it in the category of overseas spending, and that's everything. State Department spending, building embassies in Baghdad, the military operations, and foreign aid, and it's about $1.4 trillion a year, so we can cut a lot from that. And I think that's the easiest place to cut, because politically it should be easy. I was saying before that too often the Republicans and Democrats got together and agreed on spending. Seems like we should be able to get together and agree not to spend so much money overseas. We should be keeping this money in this country, helping the American people, what we ought to be doing. But essentially half would come from overseas spending. That would be $500 billion. The rest would come from departments. There's 5 departments I would cut. The top-notch department would be the Department of Education. I don't see why we need a Department of Education. But it would still need a lot more, even get to $1 trillion. We'd have to move the baseline back to about 2006. But government wasn't too small in 2006. It was too big then. So just going back to that baseline, then we can have real cuts. Whenever you hear in Washington, the Congress or the president or somebody talking about these cuts and this slashing and, you know, super committees cutting $1 trillion, it has nothing to do with cutting. What they're doing is cutting proposed increases. It's built into the system. They have baseline budget, and it's to go up automatically 10 years out. Used to be we complained about the communists having 5-year plans. We have 10-year plans of continuous deficit financing. So what this would do is, what they would do is cut $1 trillion over 10 years, $100 billion a year. compared to what I'm talking about real cuts, and then going back to that baseline. And we could do it. We could have the budget balanced in 3 years. If the economy surged back, which it could, it might even happen sooner. But we have to do something. We just can't believe that just spending money and printing money and borrowing money is going to bring the economy back, because I think Europe right now is in big trouble because we're all interconnected, and they've distorted their economy as well as China. China had a thing going there. We exported dollars. We imported their stuff. They have our dollars over there. Now they have us sort of under the ropes, over the ropes. But they've inflated their currency too. There's a lot of distortion there. So there will be some sudden changes over there as well. So we have to think about sound economic policies. And of course, when I talk about that, we have to think soundly about what our Constitution says, what liberty is, and what free markets are like, what sound money is all about, and having a proper foreign policy so that we don't waste so many resources.
And I think a lot of the military understand the distinction between foreign military spending versus defense spending, because you get twice as many contributions from military as all the other candidates. So, I think that becomes very clear. Now, speaking of economic recovery, the new jobs report came out. Are we out of the woods? Has the economy recovered?
No, but there were a couple more jobs created this past month than they had thought would be, and it sounded like this is real positive. And I watch the markets real closely because they immediately discount everything. Even though it might not be long term. They immediately discount it, and I thought, oh, this will be very favorable. And I think it blipped up a little bit, and before you knew it, the stock market closed down. So the market players didn't think too much of this. But there were increased jobs. We have to be pleased with this. But they're not telling you the truth compared to what? They say that unemployment was up to 9%. Now it's down to 8.5%. But that's not counting the people who have been out of a job for more than 4 weeks. They don't count them anymore. And people who are very partially employed, have just part-time jobs, they don't count them anymore. So if you count the way they did during the Depression and other years of the unemployment is probably closer to 20%. And that's why there is a disconnect. The people feel worse than the government tells you you're supposed to feel. The government tells you no inflation, it's only 1 or 2%, and there's not that bad of unemployment. It's just 8% of unemployment, but the unemployment rate is much bigger. The inflation is much worse. Standard of living is going down. People on fixed incomes know about it, and the middle class is shrinking. This is a characteristic of a country that lives beyond its mean. A free market and a sound money gives you the largest, wealthiest middle class, which we used to have. But now our middle class is shrinking in size, and their standard of living is going down. And that's why if we don't change our policy, this will continue. But very possibly we could go over like a cliff and suddenly have it sink rather rapidly. And that, of course, is why I think it's so important that we do something to prevent ourselves from getting that bad a shape.
Thank you. We're going to open it up now to the audience for questions. I imagine there's just a couple Ron Paul supporters here who know they're going to vote for Dr. Paul. But the primary is only 4 days away, and we need people that are not sure of who they're going to vote for to ask questions, so they have an opportunity. This is a big group, so really, let's please leave the questions for undecided voters, and we'll open it up. And there's going to be some people going around with microphones, so you can hold your hand up and they'll come to you.
Hi, Dr. Paul. First, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the 110,000 self-employed people in New Hampshire and the 23 million self-employed in the United States for supporting our equity, the Equity for Our Nation Self-Employed Act, which would at least enable us to deduct our health insurance premium as a business deduction. Really, that's so important. I have two questions, both of which are pretty straightforward, and you're a pretty straightforward man. The self-employed in this nation are really suffering from this 15.3 self-employment tax flat tax on all our income. The first question is, would you consider cutting that in half so that the self-employed only pay the employee's share of Social Security? And my second question is, and I really don't know this answer, but I couldn't find it in your book, so I'd like to know, what is your position on corporate personhood? Thank you.
Corporate
personhood.
On the taxes, my goal is always to get the taxes as close to zero as possible, whether it's corporate tax or income tax. This thing, we did pretty well all the way up until 1913. We didn't have an income tax, but the government was very small. And that's the way it should be. The people should be in charge of their money, and therefore you wouldn't have to have an income tax. We're a long way off from that. So anything that we can cut is good. Now on the medical, being able to deduct that as a small individual or a small business, that got out of whack probably back in the 40s or something, where corporations would provide the medical benefits, they'd get the deductions, but the people who weren't involved, then if an individual went and bought it, they didn't get the tax deduction. So it was very, very unfair. It should actually, the corporations shouldn't have been involved in it. It would have been better for all of us to assume responsibility, that we go out and buy our insurance and look for the policies that are automatically transferable, and it doesn't go with our jobs. Then it became a problem because your insurance was associated with your business, and then you had to say, well, we're going to move it, and then it's going to go to another company. Complicated. It should have been the private all along, but I would do anything I could to get the proper deduction. Matter of fact, the one thing, and this, of course, is going in the opposite direction of what Obamacare does, and what we should do is make sure that anybody and everybody can get their money back through a tax credit of some sort, and maybe have tax, a savings account, which is totally tax deductible, and then if that's tax deductible, get a major medical policy. And the important reason for that is it would get the doctor and the patient talking to each other again. Now it's corporate medicine, and the lobbyists in Washington some of the big players don't care about how big the government is. They just want to get in and get part of the pie. So you have the drug companies and insurance companies and health management companies. So it is very much a corporation. On personhood of the corporation, individuals, personhood implies rights. Only individuals have rights. You don't have rights by groups. The difficulty with having rights by groups, there's two reasons why that isn't good. One, you punish a group, which we all have had to live through a system of punishment by certain groups and discrimination against groups, and that's wrong. But privileges to groups aren't any better, so that's why we should all be individuals. And if you happen to have a legal organization, it's the individual that should be responsible, and the corporation itself isn't a person. Only we as individuals are.
Good evening, Dr. Paul. Thank you very much for being here. My question is a continuation of the health care issue. I've spent most of my life as an advocate for children, especially disabled children. And I understand from your plan, if I get it correctly, that you would like to see an end of Medicaid and Medicare because they're government-run programs. And, that's possible, but how would we assure that people who are virtually uninsurable would be covered by companies who are in the profit-making business? That's a tremendous concern, and I've seen families that can't get coverage if they don't have it through work or through the government. There's nobody that's going to take care of those kids.
No, it's an important question because even if one agrees that we shouldn't have ever started it and we all should have been assuming responsibility for ourselves, we're not there now. We have a system where we're very dependent. Now, I know some people say that thing that it sounds like right up at the top, I'm going to cut those medical programs, but that isn't mine. In a way, I have a very modest position on this because earlier on, I mentioned, where I'd cut. Overseas spending, the wartime spending, some of the departments,